The 17th reading from the Torah is named Yitro, or sometimes we'll say Jethro, but his Hebrew name is Yitro, which is the literal Hebrew name behind the word or the name Jethro. And the title comes from the first words, of course, of that first verse, which says, "Now Jethro, a priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people." Now, the portion that we read today tells the story of Jethro's visit to the camp of Israel, and then it relates that the great theophany. Okay, what's a theophany? That's a vision of God. Okay, that's a big, nice word. Theophany means that you've seen a vision of God. So remember that word, and then that way, in a conversation with your neighbors, you can really impress them with what, a theophany. Okay? And where this theophany, where God gives Israel the Ten Commandments and invites the people to enter into a special covenant relationship with him. Now, today, I'm going to look at the Ten Commandments and the language leading up to them with two different lenses, okay? Many scholars consider the language surrounding the Ten Commandments as being what is called a suzerain treaty. And actually this idea has only been around a couple of hundred years, actually, even less than that possibly, where a professor who was looking at the treaties of the Hittites, he noticed similarities with the structure of the treaty to what he saw in the Bible. So what is a suzerain treaty? A suzerain treaty is a document or a peace treaty between a strong entity like the suzerain or the sovereign, the conqueror, the king. Okay, that's the big kahuna. Okay, that's the one. Okay, it's between him and a lesser entity, sometimes called a vassal, and usually it's the ones that lost the war. Okay, it's the ones that it's the peons, it's the peasants, it's the ones that lost out. Okay, and so over the years, Israel had most likely been signatory to several such treaties. Now, we don't have any surviving copies of treaties between Israel and Assyria or Israel and Babylon. Okay, those just didn't exist as an example. But there are other treaties that survive the ravages of history dating back to the times of the Hittites, around 1400 BCE. So we have those. I mean, they're written down in tablets, and that's how come we know the structure of these suzerain treaties. Now, the typical suzerain treaty consisted of several sections, and there's some agreement, some disagreement as to what each one of these were, but most generally they say that there's about six sections, okay? And the first one is the preamble, and that identifies who the sovereign is, okay? It tells who the chief kahuna is. That's the boss. And then there's a historical prologue, and that describes in detail the circumstances of the previous relationship between the two parties, listing the great things that the suzerain had performed for the benefit of the vassal. They somehow eliminate the part of, we got into a big battle, a war with you guys, and we handed your head to you on a platter. They don't say that so much that. They said, we have come into your country and protected you from all of those who would do you harm and things like that. You know, they made it kind of flowery. There were stipulations and obligations. And these varied depending on the situation. The condition of the vassal nations, you know, who was being basically told you better put up or shut up. And then it was also just the whim of the suzerain. Whatever the king decided he wanted to put in there as you will do this or you will do that, you will wear funny purple hats every Thursday, you know, and things like that. So then there was also, in fourth part, there was a provision for the deposition or the storage of the treaty and when it would be read, you know, how often it would be read for the people so that they would know what they had to do. Then there was a list of witnesses, and then there was blessings and curses. Now the blessings accruing to the vassal for obedience to the treaty, and curses or penalties of the that would accrue for disobedience. Now, I don't have time this morning because it's long and involved to go into detailed description of all the parts of a suzerain treaty, but we can identify how the Ten Commandments and Deuteronomy fit the pattern of the typical suzerain treaty. Now, all right, I should have placed some jokes in here because I know this is a really boring sermon for some of you, okay? But I didn't have any jokes. The preamble, Exodus 20, first part of it, it says, I am Adonai, your God. Okay, now that pretty well sums it up, and that tells us, okay, who the boss is. Okay, I am Adonai, your God. Then there's the historical prologue. Okay, now this is pretty simple in this instance. It says, it's just the next part of the sentence. It says, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, this section is also greatly expanded if you look at what in Deuteronomy chapter 1 through chapter 4. Remember, Deuteronomy was called what? The second reading. It's where it's reiterated what the law was. So these stipulations, as the Lord's vassals, the corporate nation of Israel and individually were forbidden from forming an alliance with other foreign deities. How do you say that? Okay, they were not supposed to worship other gods. Okay, now enmity against the true God or showing disrespect for the sovereign was also forbidden. What did God say? Don't take my name in vain. Lack of respect indicated a rebellious attitude, and the suzerain would not tolerate it. Hashem knew that fraternizing with ideas and material things from the foreign nations that were around them would turn the minds of the people away from him. So he included stipulations regarding just those situations. Paralleling the requirements of the vassal to appear before the suzerain on a regular basis, they had to read the Torah on a regular basis. We find that the Decalogue, what's the Decalogue? That's the Ten Commandments. Okay, another big word for you. Okay, write that down. The Decalogue stipulates that each week the vassal was to appear before the Lord and hear the reading of the words of the covenant. Okay, do we do that? Yeah, it's called Shabbat services, okay? And so if you're not here on Shabbat services, you're not enjoying what God had said was reading of his word before you. And this would show enduring confidence in the suzerain as their Lord and their master. It was understood that the word of the sovereign Lord and master could not be changed in any way. Where have we heard that one before? Don't change a thing in the Torah. Tribute could also be defined as what? Taking in the forms of tithes and offerings. Okay, that's the tribute that would accrue to the sovereign. And the sacrifices that were also outlined were part of that tribute and offerings to the Lord. Now, the remainder of the Ten Commandments was the core of human behavior that was expected by the vassal Israel. God expected this. These rules were given so that God's chosen people had a framework from which to live their lives, their daily lives, in peace, harmony, and mutual respect. Now, the deposition and witnesses part of it, there were two identical copies of the commandments that were to be placed in the ark. Okay, did you know that the ark held both copies of the Ten Commandments? All right, it wasn't like 5 on one side and 5 on the other one, you know, like in the movies. There were, each one of them was a full Ten Commandment thing, okay? And they were put in there. Well, why would you do that? Well, there's a reason, because there were two parties. There was God, he had his copy, and Israel, and they had their copy. It's just like if you go and buy a house, the bank gets one copy of the mortgage and you get one copy of the mortgage. It's the same kind of concept. The blessings and curses. Now, these are spelled out not so much in chapter 19 of Exodus, but they're spelled out, or chapter 20 actually, but they are spelled out later in the book of Deuteronomy, and they were actually reinforced by the tribes, because God told Moses that when you get over there, you take this number of the tribes, you half of them, and you're going to go on Mount Gerizim, and the other side you're going to go over to Mount Ebal, and you're going to shout back and forth to each other the blessings and the curses. And so that's a pretty good reinforcement, and just the structure of those mountains made them just kind of a natural amphitheater to where the people, when they shouted, it really echoed. So the covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai was an eternal covenant, okay? It was not one that God would break. Now, the people broke it many times, but God never did. Now, the times of exile and punishment were a direct result of their own disobedience, and it had been clearly delineated in the blessings and cursings, the terms of the covenant. If this is what you do, if you do this, you will be blessed. But if you don't do that, if you disobey me, you're going to be cursed. So, I mean, it was all written down there. They had no one to blame. You know, they said, well, what about the fine print? Well, the fine print was there. Unfortunately, though, with the coming of the Messiah and his work on the cross, there are those that say, well, the law of Moses is no longer in effect. And I've actually seen a messianic leader that got up and said, because of the law of Christ, the law of Moses is dead and of no effect. And so when that was brought to my attention, of course, I disagreed very, very forcefully. And we had no small amount of disputation there, okay? We'll just say it that way. And as a result of that, we started Tree of Life Messianic Congregation. That's how that turned out. But, a lot of times you'll hear that the law was nailed to the cross and we no longer have to follow Torah. Well, what part of Torah do we not follow? You know, the part that says that you honor your mother and father, is that you take that one out? Or I'm telling you right now, kiddos and some that are even older, that's still there. He said, honor your father and mother. What about the part that says you don't covet your neighbor's wife or his donkey? Now, that's funny how that turned out, wasn't it? You don't covet something. You don't steal. It says, and you just got that, okay. And you do all sorts, there's certain things. Which one of the 10 Commandments don't we follow anymore? Well, I can't find a single one of them that we are no longer following. And, you know, there are those that are going to argue about, okay, keeping the Sabbath. Well, that, I'm not going to get into that as to what, you know, we believe that the Sabbath, Saturday in our calendar, is the last day of the week, and that's when we should be worshiping the Lord, okay? Now, there's that do it on the first day of the week, but they're still worshiping the Lord. They just a day late, okay? Also, I don't know if you know this or not, but in the millennial period, there will be sacrifices in the temple again. I was discussing with a pastor out in Lubbock, Texas, yesterday, day before yesterday, regarding all sorts of things. I mean, it was supposed to have been about a 30-second conversation that turned into an hour and a half, but that's okay. But we got to talking about the millennial period and the temple, and he said, so you actually believe that there has to be a third physical temple? I said, yes, because they talk about sacrifices being done. You can't do sacrifices in your heart, because I've heard people say, well, we're the temple of the Holy Spirit now, and so that's the third temple. No, it's not, okay? It has to be a third physical temple before the coming of the Lord. But then in the millennial period, there will be sacrifices, okay? Animal sacrifices in the temple. It will not be for atonement, because that's already been taken care of. But there will be sacrifices for what? For remembrance, as a memorial, for people to know that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And so there will still be the various sacrifices. We'll still be able to do a fellowship offering and the various other ones. So even that part of the law, right now we're kind of in a pause on that part. It's kind of a parenthetical, but we're actually going to come back and have those parts renewed again. Yeshua said that in Matthew 24:35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So what's his words? The law. The law is here to stay, friends. It ain't going anywhere, okay? It's here. So let's go back to Sinai and take another look at the circumstances leading up to the giving of the Torah. Now, perhaps we need to even redefine the relationship between God and Israel. Was it a relationship between a sovereign and a subservient people? There are those that point to the format of the Suzerain Treaty, and they believe it to be so. And it is a valid view, okay? And I'm not arguing against those kind of people because, you know, I see it also as part of a Suzerain Treaty. It's easy to look at that part and say, yeah, that is a Suzerain Treaty. But I think there's another relationship between God and the family that was led out of Egypt. You know, that's what it was. It was a family led out of Egypt, okay? Now, it had grown from that 70 to a couple of million folks, they say. And so they led them out of Egypt. There was a different relationship. Now, First Fruits of Zion had several articles in which I'm paraphrasing some of this stuff, and so I'm going to give them credit for putting it into words what I was trying to think. In Exodus 6 and 7, the Lord told the children of Israel, I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. Now, this phrase was an adaptation of an expression from the, sphere of marriage, okay, that I will take you. The ancient Near East wedding formulation was, you will be my wife, I will be your husband. In the Hebrew Bible, it's common to speak of marriage as taking a wife. You know, that various prophets or kings or people, they went out into another area and they took a wife. And so, you know, they didn't drag them off by the hair like the cavemen or something like that. No, it was just to say they went someplace and they wooed somebody, they courted them, and they brought them back as their wife, okay? So they just went and took a wife. God likened himself to being a suitor and the people of Israel to the young woman he was courting. He was not content to simply redeem them from slavery. He wanted to make them his very own people and enjoy an intimate relationship with them, like that of a husband and a wife. Exodus 19:5 says, now then, if you listen closely to my voice and keep my covenant, then you will be my own treasure from among all people. For all the earth is mine. Now, this is covenantal language here. God wanted to enter into a covenant with Israel. A covenant is a contractual agreement that specifies the terms and conditions of a relationship. The marriage metaphor is a good way to understand the covenant of Sinai. Now, the sages speak of Exodus 19 as God's betrothal of Israel. That's what the ancient Jewish sages say. At the foot of Mount Sinai, God officially asked for Israel's hand in marriage. He spoke to her lovingly. He reminded the people of how he had carried them out of Egypt, as if they were on the wings of an eagle. Now, I think I've also preached a couple of sermons about how God brought us out on the wings of an eagle, and how He brought them unto Himself. He promised to make them His own special treasure above all the other peoples in the world. Now, He said, "You will be my possession." Now, the Hebrew word that I think it's the NASB. What is that? The New American Standard Bible. That translate as possession. It's the Hebrew word is segulah. Okay, and it's some versions translate it as beloved treasure or peculiar treasure, specific treasure. In the ancient Near East, the term segulah was used to describe a king's prize trophy. Now, when a king's army vanquished an enemy, the king kept the most valuable items for his own treasure. A precious object like that was called a segulah. In Exodus 19:5, the word is used as a term of endearment for Israel. So God is calling Israel His segulah. God says that He will make the Israelites His specially prized treasure. He says that even though He owns the entire earth, Israel will always be His special people. Now, this can be compared to a king who has conquered many lands and possessed, like, say, Alexander the Great, somebody like that. And he possessed great wealth. The treasuries were filled with valuables, but there was one special gemstone that he valued above all others. Now, rather than put it in the treasury or put it in the museum so everybody can go around and see the crown jewels, he hung it on a golden chain, and he wore it around his neck every day so he could see it. This is my special treasure. That's the way God looks at Israel and each one of His children. We are His special treasure. In the traditional Jewish wedding, the bride and the groom are married beneath a canopy called a hoopa. And, this is a hoopa here, this structure here. In fact, we've got people in this congregation who were actually married under a hoopa. I think maybe even that hoopa. And now, of course, we dressed it all up with all sorts of other stuff around it and made it all so fancy and everything. But that's a hoopa, okay? And the word is used several times in the Bible. In Joel, the 2nd chapter, and verse 16 said, "Let the bridegroom come out from his bedroom, and the bride from her." And a lot of translations say chamber. But if you look in the Hebrew, the actual Hebrew, it says hoopa, okay? And then Psalms 19:6, it's like the bridegroom coming out of his bridal chamber, hoopa. That's the word that is used in the Hebrew. The hoopa represents the new house being formed by the union of the bride and groom. Those words I used in the wedding ceremony, that this covering here symbolizes the new house that this couple was embarking on in this marriage. Now, was there a hoopa at Mount Sinai? The cloud of glory over the mountain can be compared to a hoopa. A similar image appears in the prophecies of Isaiah. Isaiah said, and in the Messianic age, God will spread a canopy of cloud over Jerusalem. And I'll read it. It says, Isaiah 4:5, "Then Adonai will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her convocations a cloud by day and smoke and a shining shining of a flaming fire by night, for over all the glory will be a hoopa, is the word used. Now, Mount Sinai itself has been likened to a hoopa. Exodus 19:7 says that the people stood beneath the mountain. Now, this would be like a bride standing beneath the hoopa. So, okay, now we can't get this idea, like I've seen it pictured in ancient Jewish writings, that the mountain actually just lifted up, and the people were standing beneath the mountain with this mountain over the top of them. No, they were down at the bottom of the mountain, and all of the lights, the flashing of the lightning in the cloud and everything was covering them. So they were they were at the foot of the mountain, okay? Exodus 19:20 says, Then Adonai came down unto Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and Adonai called Moses to the top of the mountain, so Moses went up. God descended on Mount Sinai in the midst of smoke and lightning and just a symphony, or maybe I should call it a cacophony of trumpet blasts. It was so much, they said it was a terrible shofar, and it was so loud and piercing that the people trembled, and the rock shook, the whole mountain shook. There was earthquakes. And so the writer of Hebrews described it as a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and whirlwind. Now, that's in Hebrews 12:18. So terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I am quaking with fear. Even Moses was kind of shook up. It was the grand entrance of the groom into the hoopa. I tell you what, God knows how to make a grand entrance, doesn't he? In the traditional Jewish wedding, a marriage contract is read aloud to the bride and the groom as part of the covenant ceremony. This written contract is what? It's called a Ketubah, okay? And the Ketubah spells out the terms and conditions incumbent upon the man and the woman for the marriage. And so it's kind of like a prenup, isn't it? Something like that, yeah. After the ceremony, witnesses sign the Ketubah. In Jewish tradition, then, the Ketubah is framed very nicely and hung on the wall, so that everybody that comes in your house can say, yep, they're married, all right, and these are the terms of their marriage. She gets what? So it's all written in there. And so I've done, a number of those ketubahs and written them out and signed them. Now, in the wedding at Mount Sinai, the Torah is the ketubah. It's the legally binding covenant covenant contract between God and his bride Israel. Okay? From atop Mount Sinai that day, God spoke the 10 Commandments to all Israel. This can be compared to the reading of the Ketubah in a wedding ceremony. Similarly, and according to Exodus 24:4, Moses will read the book of the covenant to the assembly of Israel. So Moses then read it in Deuteronomy, we see. This is I know it's a different way of looking at the commandments. So the commandments and the Torah. So we should not think of them as rules imposed by an impersonal government, because sometimes that sovereign, he just makes out the rules and then he goes off to conquer other worlds. But not so much here. These are more like wedding vows, joyously taken by a blushing bride on her wedding day. And if we understand the Torah as a ketubah, we see that it is far more than an ethical system or a moral list of do's and don'ts. All right? Instead, it functions as the sacred marriage covenant between God and his people. It lays out the parameters of our relationship with him and outlines the expectations. Its specific instructions and stipulations are designed to make the marriage happy. It's designed to make it fruitful. It's designed to make it functional. It defines the obligation of both the husband, God, and the wife, us, and describes how each are to treat each other. I think that God probably fulfills his part of it a whole lot better than we do ours, doesn't he? So, is the Torah a legal document handed down by a conquering king, or is it a legal document jointly entered into by two parties that love each other? I think it could be a little bit of both. God gave us the Torah as a roadmap and to document his standard of holiness. Paul said that without Torah, we would not know what God expected of us. But Torah is also a gift of grace. It teaches us God's ways, and it lets us know thousands of times that he loves his bride. He loved us so much that he gave his only son to die on the cross for us. That's how much he loves us. And so I think, that covenant, God's word, God's covenant is a forever covenant. We don't ever have to worry about God pulling the rug out from under us and falling flat. The salvation that Yeshua bought with his own blood is a forever salvation. I'm not saying that, just so you know, I'm not saying it's eternal security. I'm saying that God's plan of salvation will never be withdrawn. If you accept Yeshua, then you are his, and the only way that you can ever not be in a condition of righteousness with the Lord is for you to walk away from it, okay? So I'm not teaching eternal security here, just so that nobody gets too wound up, okay? But it's a forever contract, a forever covenant. God will always love us.